Well, I think that's my cue. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jonathan Tepperman. I'm the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. As you see, this is our roundtable on media technology and multiple versions of the truth. So we're here to talk about misinformation and how to live and navigate in a post-truth world. It's an enormous topic, and we have an enormous group of people on stage. So I'm not going to waste anybody's time by giving a ponderous introduction, besides which I know much less about the topic than everybody else here, so I would only embarrass myself if I tried. Since this is supposed to be a round table, although it's not actually round, and not a panel, I really want to get everybody talking rather than just responding to my questions. So in that spirit, rather than introduce everyone, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. So again, I'm Jonathan Tepperman, editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy. The other Jonathan, why don't you start, and then we'll work our way around.
I am Jonathan Albright, and I am with Columbia University, the Tao Center, and my title is Director of Digital Forensics. So what I do is I research campaigns and events and news events and look at manipulation and do a lot of tracing of social media and tracing of content and tracing of also impact metrics. And I've looked at a lot of different elections and campaigns over the past couple of years, including the manipulation of social media in the 2016 US presidential election. And we just did a study with the SSRC on Islamophobia online. So this is a big report. You can find it on SSRC's website. So I do larger projects, I suppose, rather than very small, narrow studies. But that's my bio. Yep.
Hi, I'm Sarah Krebs. I'm a professor of government and law at Cornell University and a faculty affiliate at the Cornell Tech campus in New York City. And my research is on issues of international security and US foreign policy. My particular angle, this nexus of tech, media, and misinformation is on research I've done with a group called OpenAI, Ethical AI Research Group. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, in my remarks.
Thanks. I'm Peter Micek. I'm General Counsel at Access Now. We are a human rights organization that works at the intersection of human rights and technology globally. I'm also an adjunct professor at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, where I look at internet governance processes. So Access Now sees this through the lens of often security and security of at-risk users who come to us to our 24-hour-a-day digital security helpline, often the targets of targeted and concerted campaigns of abuse and harassment online, as well as privacy invasions that aim to take control of or even hijack their own social media accounts. So we work closely with the social media providers to ensure security and freedom of expression. Thanks.
And I'm Louise Mushikiwabo. I'm the head of the Organization of French-Speaking Countries, Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. I am also former Foreign Minister of Rwanda, former government spokesperson, former Minister of Information. So this topic is of great interest to me. A particular angle for my organization, and of course as a former government minister, is beyond the use of untruths for political purposes, to discredit political opponents and all that. I represent a group of 88 countries and governments, and I'm very concerned about the average citizen who can be misled with very, very serious consequences.
I'm Alina Polyakova. I'm from the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., where I'm the Director for Global Democracy and Emerging Technology. What that means in practice is that I've spent many years, too many years, working on issues of disinformation, digital disinformation, specifically at the nexus of trying to understand how governments, researchers, and industry should respond to disinformation beyond looking at content specifically. And in particular, I also run a podcast called The Arbiters of Truth on the Lawfare platform, which I'd encourage all of you to look up.
A very good afternoon to you all. My name is Fabrizio Hochschild. I work for the United Nations, and I advise the Secretary General on issues relating to digital technology, and in particular, how it can be better steered to support and not undermine human rights, to support and not undermine peace and security, and to support and not undermine sustainable development.
I'm Ben Smith. I'm the editor of Buzzfeed News, and yeah, these are sort of the waters we very much swim in and cover.
I'm Kim Dozier, a newly minted contributor to Time Magazine, and I'm also an analyst on CNN. But I think the thing that most relates to this panel is I took a year and taught at the U.S. Army War College and taught State Department officials, U.S. troops. What amazed me was how little they knew about how the media works and the rules of the road. And if you don't know which media to choose according to what you're looking for, that can contribute to disinformation, because you can decide, oh, everybody's writing from a point of opinion, and therefore I can't trust any of it, as opposed to understanding the difference between the opinion page and the normal news cycle. Thank you.
Afternoon. My name is Dipayan Ghosh. I'm the co-director of the Digital Platforms and Democracy Project at the Harvard Kennedy School and a lecturer at the Harvard Law School. Prior to that role, I served as a technology and economic policy advisor in the Obama White House, and later as a privacy and public policy advisor at Facebook. Over the past couple of years, I've been conducting research on digital platforms and the ways that their economic logic is tied to such problems as the disinformation problem. Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much. So I'm going to start by asking a few questions, but I really hope that this will be a conversation. So feel free to jump in whenever you want to add something or you have a question to pose yourself. Just make sure you signal me first so it doesn't become totally chaotic. So, you know, part of what makes this issue so complex and hard to deal with is the fact that it is so complicated and involves so many different angles and so many different discrete problems, all of which we all have to confront. So we could easily spend the hour or the 40 minutes that remain to us talking about every one of, or any one of these single problems, from the growth of political polarization to the death of authority and expertise to the rise of new technology like deep fakes, et cetera, et cetera. In order to make the conversation manageable, however, I think we should probably focus on one aspect of it. And I think that should be the weaponization of truth and the deliberate spread of disinformation and misinformation. So my first question is information a tool that is only used by criminals and authoritarian states today against democracies? Is this a case of bad guys versus good guys? Or is this more like cyber, where the weapons are now used both ways? And I think the answer is really important because it will have all kinds of implications for strategy, especially whether deterrence is possible, and also whether different kinds of governments with different ideologies can nonetheless unite in the fight against this kind of misinformation. So that's a question for everyone. I'm going to pick on somebody unless anybody wants to jump in. Alina, go ahead.
Well, maybe just to start the conversation, I would lean very much on the latter version of that, meaning that all technologies have dual-use components to them, which can be used for good or evil, in quotation marks. And we only have to look back, maybe less than 10 years to remember that at one point, with the advent of social media, we thought this was going to bring in the fourth wave of democratization across the world, as we saw all these social media power revolutions unfold across the Middle East and then in Ukraine as well in 2013, which were instigated and mobilized through social media to a large extent. And it's interesting that now we're on the complete flip side of that, which I think just very much signals how, looking ahead, many of us are concerned and thinking about the implications of AI, machine learning, and other emerging technologies. But I think, again, those are going to have dual-use capabilities and components, and I think the bigger challenge for democracies is how do we maintain a democratic domain in which these technologies remain guided by democratic principles of transparency, accountability, and integrity versus kind of reverting and being subverted by authoritarian states.
Kim, you want to jump?
Well, I'll just jump right in with stating the obvious. When you've got the US president saying on Twitter, I didn't say what you see me in that video saying, and then the people who point that out get labeled the enemy, that makes it easier to put disinformation in the space and refute it, because that becomes the question of, what is truth? Mm-hmm. And but on the counter, when you have an overreach like the Qatar hack, we that and took lessons from that and are much more skeptical about videos. I know that we always went through a rigorous fact check process at CBS and at the AP before we would use or use something in the news. And now that process is all that much harder. Skepticism is higher because we know how easy it's getting to fake something.
Fabrizio, I just want you to hold that thought if you don't mind, because I have another topic that I want us to move to, and we can come back to you. And by the way, on this subject, I think the greatest recent piece of evidence of the way this is now used both ways is the British election, where the Conservative government faked its own Twitter account to make it seem like an impartial fact-checking account before they were called on it. I want to move to the tech industry as quickly as we can, since that's such a big and important part of this conversation. First of all, I'm curious if anybody up here wants to defend the refusal of companies like Facebook, which has said that it won't fact-check political ads, to be more proactive in this struggle. Ben.
Yeah, I absolutely do. I mean, I think when Facebook, Facebook has this, I think, basically ill-judged fact-checking program where they outsource what are basically political questions to very, very junior reporters hired by news organizations so that they can say it's somebody else's fault and somebody else's problem. And I think often, they are then asking these reporters to fact-check a claim like Donald Trump is going to make the economy better, which is fundamentally a political argument. And I think that's actually very dangerous for them to treat. I don't know. I think it's a way. It's both them outsourcing what are basically their own problems, and also them treating often basically politics as a fact. Mm-hmm. And I think both of those things are really dangerous. Mm-hmm.
I want to jump in on this and connect it to something Alina said, which is that I think democracies here are asymmetrically susceptible to misinformation because of exactly what Ben was saying, is that there is an interest in being seen as amenable to free speech, because that's what a democracy is. And I think here the cure can be worse than the disease, is this sense that this becomes a form of censorship, and that these Facebook or Google is setting an algorithm in a way that is ideologically oriented, and that I think becomes really dangerous. But on this weaponization and asymmetry issue, I think and on the autocratic side, I think what we're seeing actually is a lot of countries, China's Great Firewall, the assertion of digital sovereignty so that countries can erect these barriers to the flow of data in a way that I think democracies really have a hard time doing, for good reason, I think.
Sorry, yeah, Fabrizio.
Yes, I think we have to be a little cautious about the idea of a post-truth era, as if to suggest there was another era where all politicians spoke the truth, where everything that in the media was truthful, and we've now shifted. I'm not sure that was ever the case. I think what is different is now the ability in an unmoderated space to spread factional, versions of the truth on an unprecedented scale at an absolute minimum cost, and a predilection of people more towards narrative than towards facts, which is not new, but has become more accentuated. Edelman of the Edelman Trust Barometer came to brief the Secretary General and made the point that people trust traditional media, according to his trust barometer, more than ever before, distrust social media more than ever before, but look to social media for their facts. So there's this doublethink going on where people don't necessarily believe, but espouse those views, which means that social media is promoting or disseminating a new, very fondly consumed version of the world which is pinned on factional narrative as opposed to facts. And I think the fact that social media has such a massive reach but refuses in a large part moderation is at the heart of the narrative. And I find this debate around freedom of speech quite bizarre. Nobody says, if I go into a cinema in a captive audience like this one and scream fire and cause a stampede, and somebody gets that I'm exercising my freedom of speech, they call it irresponsible. But if I do the same thing with captive followers on Facebook, I'm upholding the First Amendment. There's an irony there that I don't think our responses to have been very sophisticated, and I think only in reaction to things like the Christchurch massacre is there now a more serious debate among some of the companies to assume some responsibility for content that can kill.
Well, what that gets into is that a struggle that really gets talked about, which is that different Western democracies defend or define free speech in different ways, right? And so there's this idea that the Americans have an absolutist approach to free speech, unlike Canada and the Northern European countries. In fact, that's not true when it comes to the United States, but the way the United States handles problematic language is it calls it not speech. So when the United States wants to rule that a certain kind of discourse should be illegal, it rules it no longer to be speech and therefore subject to regulation. And crying fire in a crowded theater is the perfect example of it. It's what the law calls fighting words, or language that has such a clear connection to a kinetic physical reaction that it moves into the arena of action and not speech, but of course it's an arbitrary distinction.
Just a quick question.
Alina and then Kim.
I just want to quickly follow up on this discussion of what's the digital version of yelling fire in a crowded theater. We don't have an answer to that right now. And I think that's the bigger issue. But I actually was hoping that we could switch the conversation a little bit. And as a way of perhaps defending Facebook, which was your question earlier, and I wanted to follow up on what Ben said, I mean, we have this thing called Section 230 in the United States, which, if you're not familiar with that, is this anachronistic part of the Federal Communications Committee Code that basically was designed before the internet was what it is today, that absolves social media platforms responsibility for the content they post. So I think it has to be up to the government to act, to tell these companies who they are, who has mandate over them, because right now the FCC does not. And I think as a result, Facebook has to very carefully tread these kinds of lines. So I do have some empathy for the companies when they're getting no guidance from the US government specifically on how they should be behaving as publishers.
And why, I just want to stop you there because that's such an important point. Why have governments been so reluctant to regulate? We see the Europeans leading the way now, but in the United States, we're still not there.
I think, well, one is the issue of First Amendment versus free speech rights, which I do think is a real issue when it comes to the US versus Europe. I think two, which is I think where this conversation could go, Jonathan, but I'll leave it up to you, is that all of the regulatory frameworks in Europe have been focusing on content control. And I think this is a completely misguided view that will not get us anywhere into a sustainable regulatory framework, because it gets us exactly as Sarah said, very, very close to questions around censorship.
Right.
And so I know Dipayan has written a lot about why content moderation as an approach is a broken system. But I think this is where we need to start.
So I want to come back to government in a minute. Are you going to speak to government or on something else? government. So let's just hold fire on that, because I have one or two more questions about corporations and the tech world before we go back to that. First of all, the first question is, in a perfect world, where one of us here could dictate to Facebook or Twitter what they should be doing to combat misinformation, what would your orders be? And how do you think this would solve the problem? Does anybody here feel like they have the answer to that? I know you think that.
I'm not sure I have the answer, but I mean, I think many tech companies are taking measures to hold users accountable to their own internal standards. I mean, if you look at the standards for use of Facebook and other platforms, certain content is not allowed as part of the contract the users have. And I think there are ever more efforts by tech companies to uphold those. I mean, YouTube, I think yesterday or the day before, made an important announcement about a revised policy on hate speech, which they will now take down certain content. So I suspect that's the way to go. And just on the government thing, I think there's a pacing challenge. I think technology has spread at an unprecedented speed. There's nothing at all comparable in human history to the speed at which internet has reached across the globe. And I think governments have a very hard time keeping up. And there's also an attitude difference. Technology, in the words of Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg, tends to move forward and break things. Policymakers tend to be very cautious about moving forward until they have the perfect solution. So I think there's a lot of catching up to do in that respect.
Dipayan, do you see potential in these tentative moves towards self-governance, like Brad Smith's digital Geneva Conventions or Tim Berners-Lee's new contract for the web?
Yeah, I think there's some potential in some of these proposals, but revisiting this question of what companies should do, or at least what government regulatory agencies should do to the consumer internet industry, I think Alina points out an important aspect here, where there are two types of reforms or two types of regulatory structures that people are broadly speaking about. One contends with content regulation. You know, should this content be deemed disinformation or hate speech or violent conduct or not? And companies are getting more sophisticated at developing AI to answer those or address those kinds of questions. But as we discussed, as numerous people discussed, there will always be controversy around those edges around borderline content. And the second, I believe, is more important. We got into this situation of this disinformation problem and the spread of hate speech and the spread of algorithmic bias because of the economic logic underlying these platforms, which is really tied to the uninhibited collection of data and the development of algorithms that kind of are unregulated in any way, and the lack of competition in a market that has now seen monopolies across every subsector of the consumer internet. And so I think a robust regulatory framework that responds through competition policy and consumer privacy and algorithmic transparency can rebalance the power between consumers and corporates, and in the longer run suppress such problems as disinformation.
So that's a fascinating point, and it moves us into the area of business and dovetails with my next question. And I wonder if maybe the solution is, can we find a way to better align profitability with better corporate behavior so that tech firms see reform as being in their own self-interest and are better able to justify it to their shareholders?
I was going to say this matter is so complex, and it's way, way beyond Western democracies. We're playing in a space where everybody has a seat. And so beyond the corporations and the governments regulating, which I think is partly not a job of a government to regulate or tell people what to do, we need to take this misinformation and disinformation war to individuals who are on the internet, who are the consumers. And I think for companies to start changing or paying attention or even sort of regulating, they would have to be responding to the consumers. And so for me, this is a huge space, very complicated to regulate, different types of interests, companies, governments, democracies, and we need to go to the average person who's consuming this information or lack of information or untruth and educate them and find a way for them not to fall in the trap. That in turn will create a certain behavior from the different digital platforms, from whomever is the regulator. So I think there is a role to play by Facebook and company, but these digital platforms will be responding, whether it's for profit or for the advancement of technology, to the behavior of individuals. So we need to take it way down there and make sure that most of the consumers are informed, are educated. I mean, I come from Africa, and technology is just booming. In parts of Africa, you would not even believe, the most remote villages. And these are not people who are sophisticated, but they know how to use technology to their advantage. So it's something that we need to deal with across the board. I mean, as our friend from the United Nations said, disinformation or fake news is as old as the world is. It was there way before the internet, was used in different forms, rumors, manipulation, and so forth. So it's nothing new. What is new is the speed at which technology is picking up in our daily lives. So yes, companies, corporations, governments, but I think we need to go to the consumer and tell them, look, when you see this image and it looks like somebody is killing people in the streets, be careful, because this image could be not the right image. So I really think for many of us who are concerned about citizens both in countries and globally, we need to go and educate and talk to people.
So I think this point about individual responsibility is an absolutely vital one. And on that note, I want to go around the table and ask each of you the following, because we have this rare opportunity where there are a lot of different sectors represented in this conversation. And tell us what you think your industry or your sector, whether it's government, the media, NGOs, advocates, citizens groups, or citizens themselves, what is their particular responsibility in this larger fight to combat misinformation? Want to start with you, Jonathan?
Sure. So I think I want to go back to the idea that Alina introduced in the beginning about content and about our huge focus on content. And I come from a hybrid social sciences, I guess, a little bit of a journalism background, but more in the sense of understanding audiences and understanding the impact of stories. So when there tends to be an obsessive focus on when we look at content and we look at what's happening on social media, and we need to I feel we need to get beyond that, especially when we're teaching and we're training the next generation. So the biggest problem that I see that's emerging is not necessarily content, but the speed at which platforms, and this goes well beyond social media. This includes search engines. I mean, Google, for example. So we need to understand more about the role they play in highlighting and raising certain issues and selectively raising certain types of information and pulling it to the surface. So through the sharing mechanisms that have been built into Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and Google, we tend to get a different view, or a very selective view on almost a hyper-fragmented level. So across all different, so depending on who we follow, depending on what news we've looked at that day, depending on what data is stored about us, and this changes by the second. I think Google made about 2,000 changes to its algorithm just over the course of the past year. So when we talk, we can we can talk about content, we can talk about what's on social media, but we also need to understand the design of the platforms, and we need to understand more about how these are built, and then try to insert responsible safeguards so this doesn't happen, because these platforms are built at scale, and we're not going to go back and change how Facebook was built or how it was fundamentally designed.
But to my question, whose job is that to make that happen?
I mean, that's policy, but there's often, when people reply to Donald Trump, for example, this is the perfect example of selective agenda setting. It's pulling his remark, even if you're disputing whatever a politician says, you're raising it to the surface in other people's profiles. So there's an amplification, and as educators, I feel that we have a bigger responsibility to teach journalists not to retweet or not to, to be careful about how they reply and to be careful about how they link to stories and share things, because there's a lot of amplification going on that's not necessarily productive.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on the issue of the consumer because that's something that actually Mark Zuckerberg talked about recently, that the consumer should decide what's credible. And I think that's really, in some ways, compelling, but in other ways, problematic, because the consumer, what we know is that fake news travels faster than real news because it's novel, it's exciting. But I do think there's room here for digital literacy. And as I mentioned earlier, I've done a lot of work on experimenting with consumers to see whether they can identify and detect the difference between real news and fake news, especially in the context of AI. So AI makes all this speed even faster, even more efficient, because you can generate news stories really quickly, overcoming the bandwidth problems that are associated with the human production of news. And it turns out that consumers are really bad at detecting differences between real and fake news, except that they, in some ways, trust their judgment. They say things like, well, it had facts in it, so it must have been right, even though there were aspects of it that didn't sound right. So what that suggests, I think, is that there is room for digital literacy to identify some of the correlates, let's say, of misinformation or disinformation.
Thanks. So I think I'm speaking for the NGO community, which is a big responsibility. We are going to continue clarifying and advancing norms on how to apply the human rights framework to online spaces. I mentioned an hour ago, some of the people who have done amazing work trying to bring more transparency to the platforms, to the decisions that they're making in the black box, coining that term in our spaces, and I think really foreseeing a lot of the harms that have come to businesses. I want to say that if Facebook, if others had listened to us years ago when we were talking about minimizing the data that they're collecting, minimizing the sharing of that data, and being quite transparent about the decisions over content, then they could have at least mitigated, if not prevented, some of the massive harms that groups like Cambridge Analytica took advantage of. And I say took advantage of because what they did was really just play by the rules, ad absurdum that Facebook allowed them to do. And so I think civil society, we need to be heard. I think for us, though, our space has shrunk. Our space has shrunk offline. So almost our responsibility is to have the courage to continue to participate in these online spaces despite the concerted campaigns of disinformation, abuse, harassment, and the kind of privacy invasions that go along with them. So, if you want to hear our voices, you need to come to our spaces, but you also need to I think as Facebook is learning through this content oversight board, you need to invite us into the design and the production of the platforms and the policies. And I can't say enough that space has shrunk offline, that traditional media are co-opted in so many states that we don't have a choice but to go online. So I don't know that there is a choice of whether to trust or not your online sources, because those are often the only sources.
Thank you. Louise, you spoke about citizens a moment ago, but I wonder if you want to put on your ex-government official hat now as a Minister of Information and talk about the government's role.
Well, I think both from the perspective of government, but also from my current perspective in the multilateral world, we have an obligation to alert. That's probably the best thing we can do, since we have access to so many people, including, very, very sophisticated people and just, very simple people with a minimum of education who don't understand technology and the world. Our job, both as government and as international organizations, I think we need to perhaps participate a bit in that digital literacy, but also to talk to people and say, look, don't believe in everything you read and everything you see. Again, I'm African, and I cannot tell you how much false information is out there on Africa. Has been there way before we entered this era. In Africa, this happens. Africans are like this. Africans are beggars or dictators. And I mean, it's been there for so long, and you see so many people embracing this technology as a way of sort of self-defining or occupying the space. But I usually don't agree with the media as a general thing, but I'm very happy to see that in the last maybe 2-3 years alone, practitioners in the media have been really doing a good job going through fact-checking on television, in the newspapers, pointing to what was fake news, why it was fake news, going through different steps. And I think that's a very, very important part of fighting disinformation. So I think the media has a very important role to play. If you take unsuspecting, innocent villages in Africa or in Southeast Asia, and you show them, look, this was breaking news last night, but look, this is not what was reported because this is what the location was, this is what the story was. That does a lot in terms of making people aware. So I think from a government perspective and also from the multilateral world perspective, we have a responsibility to constantly, because this technology is going nowhere and information is going to be used for political purposes. Information is power. People will continue to play with power to their advantage. So this is a long haul. We're in it for the long haul, but I see the benefit of technology as, definitely much more important than the manipulation and all that. So we should get into it and constantly alert and constantly point to what is wrong, because bad guy and good guy, it depends. It depends on what where you place yourself and what you're trying to do with information.
Thank you. Alina, and colleagues, I apologize, but I have to ask everyone to keep their comments crisp because we are already starting to run short on time, and I have a couple more questions I want to get to.
I have 3 crisp points. One, the point that was made by Jonathan and others, that there's an ecosystem here that goes far beyond the social media companies we're all comfortable with. And then what that means is that we have to start looking not at the content, but the distribution systems and delivery systems of that content. And when you open the lid on that black box a little bit, what you see is there are literally dozens and dozens of companies that none of you know the names of. They're involved in that process of content distribution and what gets delivered to us. And I will plug Dipayan's paper called Digital Deceit. I think everyone has to read this paper because it is the best explanation of how that distribution system works and how complex it is and how little we actually know about it. That being said, I think there's an assumption when we talk about individual responsibility, that individuals have some sort of free will to choose the content that they see online. And to some extent you do, but to a large extent you don't. The majority of the content, for example, on YouTube, that gets delivered to you is not by user choice. It's not by individuals going into YouTube and searching for a video. It's the algorithm deciding what you're going to see next. And there are lots of estimates about how content is delivered in this way through these engagement algorithms, but I think there's a consensus, a large amount of the billions and billions of hours that people spend on YouTube. And if you think that you're on Instagram or wherever you use your social media, when you hover over a piece of content, you don't have to click on it. that goes into feeding the engagement algorithm. So there's all these ways in which we are constantly being manipulated. So this idea of free will, I think, is also an assumption that we have, but it's not necessarily true when it comes to the social media environment anymore. And lastly, Jonathan, to your question, solutions, whose job is it? There is no silver bullet. It's everyone's job. The companies can't do it themselves, and they won't. Government regulation won't get us there either. Individual responsibility won't either. And I think the role of institutions like where I am, which is a nonprofit think tank, is to be a platform for bringing together these separate stakeholders so we can actually have a conversation, because I don't think the companies are the enemy here. It's fun to beat up on them, but we need to learn to bring them to the table.
Yeah, I think I very much echo those points. First, I think the problem is not just disinformation, it's algorithms that lead us into echo chambers that create ever greater social divides, undermine social cohesion, and avoid exposing us to other views. And that's part of the problem. We have more information than ever, we have less information than ever. And I think, as has been said, the problem is tremendously complex. I think the complexity often leads us to policy paralysis, which is exactly the problem. I think the complexity demands that we act with greater urgency along three lines. Users, as has been said, companies assuming greater responsibility, policing their own guidelines, and governments living up to the expectations of protecting the public good. But when it comes to public education, I'll just say this. I mean, digital education is a challenge in the US. Digital education is a challenge in some of the countries with the most highly developed education systems. Now imagine a country that has no history of pluralistic media, that has no history of education that fosters critical thinking towards what comes out through a dominant media, and expose them overnight to social media with no moderation of content. And what you get is what you saw in Myanmar, and it's been well documented. Massive amplification of hate speech, leading to a rise in interethnic conflict, leading to a rise in deaths. And we've seen similar things in Sri Lanka and to some extent in Libya. And it's often cross-border. You can now orchestrate a riot in Addis from the safety of a Starbucks in Washington.
And it's not just about conflict. In Samoa, where the vast majority of the population gets their information from Facebook, measles vaccination rates have dropped 28% in the last year, and more than 70 children have died because of anti-vax information that they're getting from American Facebook
And
feeds.
that's in a country with highly educated users. So I think we need, when Germany can build up a very sophisticated legal framework to ensure that social media platforms comply with its rule that its hate speech legislation applies equally online as it does offline, and social media platforms react. They build up the infrastructure to manage that law. But other countries don't have that capacity. So we need some sort of articulation of international principles on the responsible use of digital media. And platforms also need to feel a particular responsibility where governments may not have the capacities that, say, Germany has, or France, or other European nations, to uphold public safety, in particular when the content can have consequences on human life.
Ben, as you and Kim speak to this, maybe you can talk a little bit about what steps you've already taken to protect yourselves from accidentally disseminating bogus stories or educating the public through what you do.
Yeah, I think the basic thing is that these are great stories and we should report on them and tell them. Like, the story of this polluted ecosystem is a great story, and there are bad actors you can expose. There are really important decision makers, particularly at the platforms, that we try to hold accountable. And I think increasingly you're seeing the media realize that, and that's obviously part of it, and I think a big part of the media's role, right along with the traditional role of not screwing up and spreading lies. The other piece, though, I think, is that the media, this generation of legacy media in the U.S. has mostly lost the battle around trust. I think that's too bad. I'm not celebrating it, but I do think that in an environment where you basically can't take for granted that your audience is going to trust you, you have to be often kind of painfully transparent about showing the receipts of your reporting, about publishing documents, about saying you don't have to trust me, you don't have to trust my brand, you don't have to take this on faith. I mean, particularly if your brand is Buzzfeed, certainly you think that. But and the alternative is to be very, very transparent and say you can replicate this reporting yourself if you want.
So I would say the best thing that the media can do to win back that trust is set rules of the road, stick to them, and be transparent about them. If you Google AP standards and values, if you do the same thing with the Daily Beast, if you look at the bottom of every Thomson Reuters piece, there's a link to their standards and values, the rules that they have to that they have to follow. Also, when you're clear with your reader, at Foreign Policy, you have a section that says argument, and you're. And then the public, though, I think the public, to your point about the polls, is getting more sophisticated about what it's reading. And when you said a lot of people were getting their news from social media, my question was, well, we in the traditional news outlets, we're getting good about using social media too. And I'm hoping they're just using it like a highway. And I'm also just hoping that when those in the media, when enough of us get together and point out that's fake, that will create a momentum to win people back and to, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice. So, you know what I mean? That's the shame on me part. So that maybe once burned, they'll be more careful next time before believing.
I just want to address your original question by first talking about companies. I think we can conclude, based on evidence of some of the chief executives who've spoken up about these issues, that we're not going to see any action, voluntary action on behalf of companies to actually try to do anything about the disinformation problem, either by addressing content on its merits or by addressing the economic overreaches, the capitalistic overreaches of their business. We could point to Tim Cook, who only implicates companies like Facebook because it's in his business interest to point at other companies for their privacy overreaches, because implicating privacy or collecting lots of information and monetizing it is not part of his business model. Or Microsoft, we could say the same thing of Microsoft, or even Salesforce, another example of a CEO who's implicated Facebook. We can point at that example as well. Meanwhile, Facebook and Google will not do anything voluntary. Mark Zuckerberg or the executives at Google will not do anything voluntary, because why should they do anything to disturb a business model, an economic logic that contributes record historically high profit margins? They're not going to do anything on a voluntary basis. So we can leave out the possibility of corporations doing anything in public interests, because it's not in a chief executive's interest to do anything that's in the public interest. It's in his or her interest to do something in the shareholder's interest.
Well, that's why I was asking about the
Yeah.
potential to align the two, right?
The potential to align the two, I think, has to lie in governments. Addressing users briefly, I don't think that it's really possible to inform and educate citizens at mass scale. We're talking about billions of people who are coming onto the internet for the first time now, and it's going to be a tremendously difficult proposition to get companies to encourage education of users, or governments to encourage education of users that's actually going to have an impact at scale. So I think, and there are many reasons for this, like the hyperbolic discounting problem concerning privacy, or the price inelastic situation that consumers get into when they accept terms of service. It's difficult to inform an individual consumer and have them make the right choices for themselves, because it's hard for them to foresee problems like the disinformation problem or data breach. And so I think the responsibility has to lie in governments, that governments and legislatures that have the political will right now to do something, that, of course, does not mean the United States because there's a logjam in Congress. It does mean perhaps Europe, or perhaps India, or perhaps international organizations that bring governments together that do have the political will today to do something, as we've seen in the example of the European Commission. And as more governments converge on, first of all, the understanding that the real problem is the economics of this market, and second of all, understand the merits of that economic system underlying industry and do something about it through privacy and competition, and potentially even policing content around its edges, we're going to ultimately make progress. But I think the responsibility has to lie in government.
Well, we're very, very short on time now, and one of us has to catch a flight in about 5 minutes. So I'm going to close with one last question, and that has to do with social trust. Once social trust, whether in government or institutions or each other, is gone or damaged to the extent that it is already, does anybody here think that there's a way to rebuild it? Have we passed the tipping point, the point of no return, whatever cliche you want to use, or can we still get it back? Somebody give us something. Something to hold on to. Please.
I don't think we've reached the tipping point. I think to rebuild trust, even in a normal relationship, there's a conversation to have, and then you kind of observe and see if the behavior is changing. I think if it is the role of governments, I think in great part, but not only, that sort of trust has to come through perhaps other things to create a sense of, this is the place to go to for comfort. So, I mean, it's not easy, but I don't think everything is lost.
I agree with that. And if I may, the analogy I always draw in my own mind is to the American Gilded Age, a time when things in the Republic seemed about as bad as they ever could have gotten. The media was terrible and incredibly polarized and entirely profit-driven in an analogous way to the clickbait model that's used today. The country was unbelievably corrupt. Monopolies were smothering business creation. And eventually, people decided that they had had enough. And what you had was one of these rare moments where crisis starts to affect all the major actors of society at the same time, such that they come to a consensus that if they keep doing things the same way they always have, they're all screwed. And it's at those rare moments when interests align that different parties, different aspects, different factors of society start to work together. And in that case, you saw the media, the government, the corporations, and I think something analogous is possible today. Alina.
Just to pick up on that, I think we have to think about the messenger, because the messenger really matters, and we have to look for institutions, organizations in which there is still trust. So for example, we know in the United States that people tend to trust their local news outlets more than they trust the big national mainstream outlets. We know that the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in the US, still has a huge amount of trust in a way that other government institutions don't. So I think the question, to my mind, is less about how do we build trust in institution A or news resource Y, but how do we look for the messengers that are better suited to deliver information in this age of, I think, information overload and declining trust that we've seen in institutions for decades now. I just want to emphasize this is not part of the digital revolution. We've seen decline in trust across, I guess, the Western democratic world in different levels since the 70s. Certainly in the United States. So I think this is not new, but I think the reality of it has to force us to look for other potential platforms and potential messengers that people respond to.
Well, thank you. Desperate not to end on a gloomy note, despite this very gloomy subject and all the gloom out there, I want to say that there is cause for hope. The battle has been joined. You see that on this stage, and you've seen it in the halls around you over the last 2 days. So to steal a quote from Churchill, I think we can say, now is clearly not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. On that note, please join me in thanking these wonderful panelists, and thank you.